All right, let's start by looking at a couple of the environment settings. And I'm going to kind of pair this up with what you would see in the guide. So let me just find that section actually real quick because it's pretty nifty. That's not it. Manager, location, environment. Here we go. Okay, so in the guide, what you're going to see is the scene manager environment section. It's on page 38. So what this is going to do is it's actually going to tell you, and this is kind of dated, like your user interface is going to look a little different than what you see here. That's okay. The general idea of the thing is pretty much the same. So it has, like, basically I think what they did is they took the sun temperature power reflectance and they just combined it all into intensity. So except for I think they have a solar reflectance still. But anyway, so what it's going to do is it's going to talk to you, it's basically going to describe to you what certain settings will do, and it describes it fairly well. But I'm only going to pick out some of the ones that I think that you guys are going to want to focus on as we progress, namely physical sky parameters. So these are some of the hardest things to really understand. You have sun parameters, gas parameters, and aerosol parameters, right? So what that means is, like I said before, Maxwell is a physically accurate rendering engine. So it actually simulates the particulates and gases that are in the air that change the way the sky looks as you're kind of looking through the, I guess, the density of the sky. Do you guys understand why the sky looks a little bit hazier at the horizon? No? And it's bluer when you look directly up? Okay, I'll do a quick little diagram. I think it's easy enough to understand. So basically, the curvature of the Earth, right? I'm going to obviously exaggerate this, right? It drops down like that, right? So if you are standing right here, geez, I'm like totally blanking on the word for it. But anyway, the environment kind of just curves with the planet like that. Okay. The reason it's bluer up above and it's like hazier down the bottom is because when you look straight up, you only have this much air and particulates and gases that you're looking through, right? So it's clearer. You're seeing more of space. But if you look directly across the horizon, you have that much. Of course, it's like way more exaggerated than that. I think our atmosphere is only, what, five miles up, something like that. And if you go across the entire horizon, it's probably like a solid, couple 100 miles, something like that, if not more. So anyway, that's the diagram, and that's why. So all those particulates, those additional particulates, are what it's calculating. The one that I think catches most people off guard is turbidity, and the turbidity, or rather, balancing that with your wavelength. So it's really difficult. I mean, the cool thing is if you just change your turbidity and you keep some of the settings like really close, you can actually simulate sunsets pretty well just by moving where your sun is. So if you look at this example, you've got the sun kind of high in the sky in the first example, but then down here, the only difference that was made was that they moved the sun close to the horizon. So it literally is calculating the change of light as it's moving through all those particulates, right? So, and gases in particular, right? The gases are the ones that change it and make it look really orange. Okay, so that's what that does. And then the wavelength exponent is basically has to do with like the wavelength of the light that you're seeing, right? So whether or not you're going for a certain look is when you would want to move that. More important than and then scattering asymmetry, right? So scattering asymmetry, it allows more light to penetrate through some of what's the word? All right, so how do I want to describe this? All right, let me go back to the same example that I used for shadows. Okay, in shadows, when you have a sun source that's shining through like a frosted lens, right? It scatters the sun rays. That's exactly what's happening here, but to a much lesser degree. So if you've ever looked through like a 10% frosted film, where it's a little bit frosted, but you can still make out every light source, you notice that it kind of makes the light source sort of like flower out more than just the actual light itself. That's what's happening. So I do want to just highlight, though, if you look at all of these settings, okay, if you learn nothing from what I just told you, I want you to look at the numbers, okay? You've got the turbidity coefficient up there. They went from 0 to 0.04 to 0.3, okay? That change is minuscule because you could slide that thing all the way up to 100, or you could slide it to negative 100. The change is minuscule. So my general rule of thumb for you when you're playing around with these settings is to go into Rhino, Maxwell, sorry, and look at what the defaults are. Okay, so this default, let's look at turbidity, right? It's 0.04. My general rule of thumb is not to go any more than like 10% away from whatever it currently is. There are some exceptions. Turbidity can go up to like, 0.1 or 0.2 because you see that in the instructions. But when you're messing around with something like the wavelength exponent, if you have a 1.2, I wouldn't really dip it down any more than a 1.0 or maybe even a 1.3 if you're going to go up, right, or a 1.1. So I want you guys to be very cautious about changing those settings because you'll find that it gets out of hand really fast. It's kind of, it's like this curve right here. The amount of change goes really fast at first, and then it gets to a point where like you can't even tell the difference because it's just so flooded with that effect. Okay? So I think that should be clear. But let's do a couple draft renders and kind of mess around with this a little bit. So let me get up in the sky. Oh, I did want to point out one other thing before we get into this. When you go into your location and time, right now I have it set to a rendered viewport. Okay, and if you recall when I rendered it before, the shadows actually kind of cast out this way. The shadows that Rhino is generating are not the shadows that Maxwell will calculate. They are two separate shadows. Okay, so what you want to do if you want to see that shadow is you have to click on under the location and time tab. You have to click on this little sphere here, and it says show sun in viewport, and it'll switch it to show the accurate sun angle for where you have it. So that way if I change like my time of day, it's actually going to change with it. Okay, so let's do a couple of settings, and I just want to show you so that you can actually see the effect of this thing. Let's do one with standard. So I'm just going to do a quick render, and I'll let that run for a little bit. You guys have seen that before. That's just standard, so I'm going to pull it off to the side. And then I'm going to do a couple of things. The sun intensity, in my opinion, is generally defaulted to be a little bit too hot for playing around with your ISO and shutter settings when you start getting more light into the lens. So what I like to do is reduce my intensity down to 0.9. And for the wavelength exponent, I'm going to switch this to a 1.1. Planet reflectance, I'm going to switch to a 22. I think the asymmetry actually allows you to go up and down into negatives. So I'm going to switch my asymmetry to 0. And my ozone, I'm going to switch to 0.44. Okay, so I didn't change much. Okay, but what you're going to see is the difference is actually should be quite huge, unless I'm totally lying to you right now. I actually didn't change that much. Changed a little. to change that much. Stop that for a little bit. We'll do a little flip. Okay, so I was intending to change the wavelength a little bit more, but anyway, you can see it really in the sky, and I don't know how well it's going to communicate up here on that, but the difference between this sky, which is pretty low, it's got not that much going on at the horizon, and then this one, which is like really kind of blasting it. Wow, you can't even see that up there. It's like really apparent on my screen, but it's not very apparent on this one. But anyway, so the arc, do I have like a thing that I can point with? Anyway, the arc, you can't see it as well, but like the arc on my screen is showing really heavily white all the way up to here, which is really weird that it shows like still kind of blue over there. Huh. And then on this one, it's like way down here. Okay, so all we did was just change a couple of settings by a little bit, and the sky is like profoundly different. I know it's not much proof up there, so let's get a little crazy with it, and let's mess with a few more settings. I'll stop that. There we go. And oh, I didn't change the turbidity. That's why I wanted to change the turbidity. Let's go to a 0.4 instead of a 0.04. There we go. That's quite different. Even that doesn't look that different. It's like super red on my screen, and up here it's not super red. But you will be able to tell the difference. Okay, I think you can already tell that the sky is like this hazy gray all the way up to the top. It's actually reddish on mine because of the wavelength that I have too. But, whoops. Huh? What is turbidity? Yeah. It's like a measure of the particulates in the air. So I forget the exact description, but it should say it right here. Yeah, so it's the concentration and amount of particles in the atmosphere. So anyway, let me show you the comparison, right? This is the one we just rendered, and this is the one previous to it. Right, that's a pretty profound difference. Okay, and then additionally, when you've got a lot of turbidity in the air, the ISO settings and stuff get really funky to work with because you can really burn out the sky. Okay, see that? How it super burns out the sky behind it. I mean, it'll do that with less turbidity in the air, but if you're gonna go with a really high ISO, high or low. Well, ISO and shutter kind of shake back and forth, and they're balanced with one another. But anyway, if you're going to go with a lot of light in your lens, you want a lot less turbidity. Okay, does that make any sense? Okay. So anyway, that's an understanding, a small understanding of the general principles of how these settings work. The major lesson I want you to walk away with is just to be careful with them and start off small and make larger increments until you get to what you want. Okay? Does that make sense? All right. Any questions? Yeah.
Is there like the default setting so that if you mess up, you just go back?
There is. Very good question and very appropriately timed. If you go back to your environment settings and you go to presets, the cool thing is you can actually create presets for yourself. Okay? So we'll do that at some point, but you would, in order to create a preset, just create it. Right, so you click on create preset, but you can go to default and you can say reset default, and it should all go back. It did not. That's funky. Wonder if I hit a hotkey or something. Are yours going back?
No.
Oh. Yeah, there you go. Reset. Yeah, okay. Sorry. So presets, when you reset the preset, I think it's when you're switching from one to another. I think. I haven't used them as much. But don't quote me on that yet. Okay, good call. Thank you. All right, any other questions before we close this video? All right, cool.